Good evening. Welcome to our Concerned Citizens for Good Government meeting. We have the honor to have Ambassador Grover Joseph Rees as our guest speaker. He's a candidate for the U.S. 3rd Congressional District, Louisiana 3rd Congressional District office congressman. So I'll introduce him in just a few minutes. I would like to point out that our next meeting is September 19th, and our Superintendent for Public Education, Dr. Aguilar, will be here, bring us up to date on educational issues in the public school system. So make a note, Labor Day, September 5th, we have no meeting, but on September 19th, we have a meeting. So before we formally get started and introduce our guest speaker, I'd ask that Mr. Al come forward with our traditional prayer.
Our Heavenly Father, in the name of Jesus, please direct our rescue workers and their labors that survivors of disasters will be found in time. We pray that aid and support would arrive on every front. May they come with the hope of not only finding the missing, but also the means to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, and clothe the needy. Help those in authority to make the right decisions, show them ways to avoid such tragedy in the future. We pray that in the face of this tragedy, the gospel will be preached, and that grieving families will be comforted. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Mr. Al. To the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and the Republic which stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Ambassador, thank you for being here this evening. Appreciate that. We appreciate more the fact that you're spending your time and your energies and doing public service and running for office to make our community better. So thank you very much. I'd like to give a little background information on Ambassador Rees. Rees, is it Rees?
Rees.
Okay. Grover Joseph Rees is a native and resident of Louisiana. Served as the first United States ambassador to East Timor from 2002 to 2006. Prior to his appointment as ambassador, he had a distinguished career as a judge, as a law professor, as a senior officer in the executive branches of the United States government. I'll ask that he talk about that a little bit more. He has impressive credentials. He served as special representative for social issues in the United States Department of State. He's distinguished himself with reference to his responsibilities for promoting human dignity, including such issues as affecting vulnerable persons and families across the world. He served as acting United States representative to United Nations Economic and Social Council in the fall of 2007, and served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for various international organizations. He's got a wealth of experience, 7 years from 1995 until 2002 as a senior staff member of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives. He's been responsible for human rights and refugee protection, played a major role in the drafting and enactment of important human rights legislation, including Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the International Religious Freedom Act, the Torture Victims Relief Act, and others. He's got a wealth of experience as General Counsel for the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service in the early 1990s, Chief Justice of the High Court of American Samoa, Special Counsel to the Attorney General of the United States, and I saw where Edwin Meese, the Attorney General, in fact, endorsed your candidacy for the Congress here in Louisiana. Quite an honor. Law clerk in the past for the Louisiana Supreme Court, Justice Albert Tate in the 70s after graduating from law school, and press secretary for Dave Treen, one of the first Republicans to be elected governor in the state of Louisiana in the early 1970s. Taught law school at the University of Texas, right down the road. Spoken widely on constitutional issues, international law issues, and many more. Graduate Yale University, came back home, graduated Louisiana State Law School, editor-in-chief, Law Review, author of the Coist, one of 12 children. His wife is here today, we thank her, and son. He lives and works in Lafayette, and we should be embarrassed because he speaks 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5 different foreign languages, and I speak one language. Thank you for being here. We ask you to tell us a little bit more about yourself, about your candidacy, and we'll follow that by questions by me and other members of the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, I'm going to ask my wife, Londai, to let me know when I've spoken for 15 minutes, and then I'll wrap up. Thank you so very much, and I want to thank the gentleman who offered the prayer, because we do need to remember here, even though it's a sunny day, there are still people suffering from the flooding here in Lafayette and elsewhere in Acadiana and in Louisiana. And it's been heartening that people have been helping each other and that people have been cheerful through all of this. But we can't be too cheerful too soon. There are still people suffering. There's still a lot that we need to be doing. And while I thank you for the great honor of going forward with this meeting and letting me address you, I admit that I feel a little bit guilty about it because there are people who can't share our pizza with us tonight. And one of the great things about, I talk about American exceptionalism, and I do believe that the United States has a unique role to play in the world. Basically, our job is to be the good guys. But I also believe in Acadian exceptionalism. I think this is a special place. And while it would be a great honor to be a member of the United States Congress from any district, to be a member of Congress representing the 3rd Congressional District of Louisiana would be a really special honor because it is the heartland of Acadian exceptionalism. And I mean that seriously. I think that I was talking to Senator Cassidy, and he said, well, I'm not French, I'm not Catholic, and yet I think our state is characterized by those virtues of French Catholic Louisiana, that we're just nicer to people. Our hearts go out to people in ways that are not necessarily the case everywhere in the world or everywhere in the country. And I think we've had our problems. We had racial segregation in this part of the world, but I don't think we had hatred the way that they had hatred in some places. And I think that we have a lot more in common sometimes with each other because of our somewhat different culture than any of us do with people from outside. So this is a wonderful place. I think one of the reasons that it's a wonderful place, one of the results of the fact that it's a wonderful place, is that at least so far we've had a very positive campaign. You know, we've got 12 people running for Congress. At least 7 of those people are out running pretty hard, running pretty serious campaigns, and yet so far everybody has been concentrating on why you ought to vote for him, what the good things are about his candidacy, and not what the bad things are about the other people's candidacies. That's pretty rare in politics today. And I've been on the campaign trail. I've met all but, well, I've met most of the candidates, and I like all the ones that I've met. And I think that is, again, a testament to our special spirit here in Acadiana. When I came back to Louisiana 8 years ago, after an unintended 25 years of working in the government, I never thought that I would be running for office. We had a Congressman Bustani, who was doing a good job and with whom I agreed on most issues. And I hate to admit it, but he's younger than I am. And so I figured, well, he'll be there forever, and there's no need for me to even think about that. If I had been thinking about it, I probably would have made more speeches during the last 8 years. But when Congressman Bustani announced that he was going to run for the Senate in December, I had to think about it. I had to think about, is this the sort of thing that I would be good at? Is this the sort of thing I would want to do? And what I thought about mostly were the issues that are facing our country, the issues that are facing our state and our region. And I think those issues are important enough that I would have felt guilty if I had not offered myself as a candidate. People may not choose me, and I can accept that. I can live with that if that's what happens. I would love to serve, but I would feel very bad about not serving because the issues are so important, and we are at a time of crisis in this country. You know, our government just keeps getting bigger and bigger and more expensive. And people say that's inevitable. When conservatives talk about waste, fraud, and abuse, people say, how are you going to balance the budget without tax increases? And they say, well, we're going to attack waste, fraud, and abuse. And the response to that is, that's just a slogan. There is no way that just by going through the different government agencies and finding the parts that maybe are a little excessive that you'd be able to balance the budget. People act as though waste, fraud, and abuse is maybe 1% or maybe 2%. Well, I have to say, I worked in the government. I didn't see a whole lot of fraud, although the thing about fraud is they don't always advertise it, so maybe there was some that I didn't see. But I saw a lot of waste and abuse. And I want to begin by saying that there are lots of good people working in the federal government, working in government at all levels. Many of them are hardworking, many of them are very smart, but they're part of an institution, and institutions have cultures. And the culture of a government agency is to always get bigger. Every time I was a supervisor, when it got to be the end of the fiscal year, and I mean every year, people would come to me and say, there's money in our budget that we haven't spent for the year. We've got to spend it or they'll take it out of our base. And they proposed sometimes worthy expenditures, sometimes laughably unworthy expenditures, that we had to spend all the money by the end of the fiscal year. And they were horrified when I said no. They couldn't believe that I was disloyal to the division, disloyal to the agency, that I was going to let that money go to waste and let it go back to the taxpayers, and Congress was maybe going to take it away next year. People judge their success, and this is not just true in government, it's true in some private corporations, but it's also true in government. People judge their success from year to year by whether they have more people working for them, whether they have a bigger budget in their office than they had a couple of years ago. I remember I worked for a government agency once, and the head of our agency called us all together and says, next year we're going to be $1 billion agency. And he was proud of it. I can remember when $50–60 million for an agency used to be nice, quiet Washington money. No more. You know how they test the microphones in Congress, in Washington, testing 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion. Now, as I say, the fact that people want their agency, their division to be bigger Doesn't mean they're bad people, but somebody has got to say no. Government doesn't operate on a market system. You don't have to sell your product to a willing buyer, so you don't have to keep the costs down. It's Congress's job to keep the costs down. But they have in Congress, as in the rest of Washington, what President Reagan used to call the Washington buddy system. It turns out that in Congress, the job of keeping spending down is allocated to the Appropriations Committee. And the Appropriations Committee, of course, members of Congress don't do all the work themselves. They have staff members. And when you talk to those staff members, they usually worked in the agency that they are now supposed to oversee. And they understand the problems of the agency. And sometimes they understand the problems of the agency better than they understand the problems of the taxpayers. So the first thing to remember is waste and fraud and abuse are real. You can cut them. It will make a difference, and it's Congress's job. Congress is not doing that job well enough. Related to that, the question of taxes. You know, does anybody who pays taxes really think we have a low tax problem in this country? And yet every time, whenever people talk about compromise, whenever they talk about the need to see the big picture, to take the long view, that's code for the Republicans have to relent in their ridiculous insistence that we not raise taxes. Well, we've already raised taxes a lot. You know, John Kennedy, who was not considered a diehard right-wing extremist, ran the government on something like 1/5 or 1/6 per person in real dollar terms of what of what it costs now to run the government. Ronald Reagan, costs had gone up a little, but it was still 1/3 or 1/4 as much as it is now. Even at the last year of Bill Clinton, we were spending about a half as much as we are now per person. I mean, cost of government's going to go up as the population goes up, but the population hasn't gone up all that much in the last 20 years, and the cost of government has gone way up. So ideally, I'd like to have zero-based budgeting, where every year, every agency has to justify every penny that's spent. That might not be practical. We might not have that much time to go over every agency's budget that much. But can't we at least have Clinton-based budgeting? Can't we at least say you have to justify why you're spending twice as much per person as you were spending in the last year of Bill Clinton? We don't need to raise taxes. And I have taken the pledge, the American Taxpayer Protection Pledge, that I will not vote for a tax increase. We can have tax reform, but that tax reform, we can close loopholes. That has to be revenue neutral. If we close loopholes, that's great, but let's give it back to the taxpayers. Foreign policy. You've heard that I have some experience in foreign policy. And again, you need to remember institutional cultures. Why do we make such bad deals? Why do we give things to the government of Iran, to the government of Cuba, to the government of China, and we don't get anything in return in terms of their having more respect for American interests or for American values? You know, Cuba, they let a few political prisoners go, and they've gone and arrested just as many since we set up the embassy there. Iran, we're paying them not to build a nuclear bomb. You know how that worked with North Korea. We paid them for a long time to build a nuclear bomb. We still kept paying them after they built it for a while. People were asking me, why did I want to retire from the State Department? Why did I want to leave? There were lots of reasons, but the shorthand answer was, I want to be able to say exactly what I think about the six-party talks with North Korea. Why does this happen? Is it because everybody in the State Department is a bad person, is a traitor? No, they're not. Most of them are good people. Most of them are hardworking. A lot of them are smart. But the institutional culture of a foreign ministry, which is what the State Department is not to not make deals. If you're a diplomat, you don't make your career and your reputation by never making a deal with a foreign country. And you don't get a lot of credit for making a deal with Canada. The super diplomat is the guy who opens up China, is the guy who, quote, opens up. We don't really open them up, we just give them stuff. And they proclaim themselves to be opened up. China hasn't really gotten a lot better since we started giving them most favored nation status. Their government's gotten more powerful and richer. And now we're trying it with Cuba. And now we're trying it with Iran. And who knows, maybe we'll try it with North Korea again. But again, it doesn't mean that the people who are making those deals are bad people, but somebody's got to say no, and that should be the president, and if it's not the president, it should be Congress. And I promise that if I'm in Congress, I will fight to go back to an American foreign policy that's worthy of America, a foreign policy that's consistent with that protects our just interests and that also protects American values. There's another issue that I care about a lot, and people here generally, I mean, there are a lot of them. There's over-regulation that's killing our oil industry, and that's hurting every other industry in the country. You know, we're going to have fluctuations in price, but if you have fluctuations in price and you can make your own business decisions, you can bounce back from fluctuations that aren't good for you. But if the government is already making 90% of your decisions and only leaving a few for you to make, there's a lot fewer ways you can bounce back from adversity. The Second Amendment, gun rights, it's in the Constitution. The government isn't going to be able to protect us from all the bad people, and if they can't do that, I just don't think they have the right to take away our own right to protect ourselves. It's that simple, even if it wasn't in the Constitution. But the issue that I probably care the most about all the issues, because it's the one that's getting the most people killed, is the issue of the right to life. And our profound disrespect for the right to life since the Supreme Court's decision in Roe versus Wade in 1973. You know, I had just gone to work for Congressman Dave Treen. It was January. I'd just been there for 2 weeks. I literally couldn't believe that the Supreme Court would do that they would say everybody has the right to kill their unborn child, no matter what the state law says, overturn 50 state laws on abortion. I went into Congressman Treen's office the next day with a draft constitutional amendment that would overturn Roe versus Wade. He introduced that amendment a few days later. It's been 40 years. We still haven't solved the problem. But we're too good a country not to be able to solve that problem. A society is judged. When we look back on other societies, when we look back and we judge them partly on how they treated the people who were most helpless. And we're not doing very well. We still have 1 million abortions, roughly 1 million abortions a year in this country. Until we change the Supreme Court or the Constitution, there's not much we're going to be able to do about that, but we can at least chip away at the edges. We can pass legislation and try to get the president to sign it and try to overturn the president's veto if the president is somebody who won't sign it, that at least says you cannot kill unborn children who are capable of pain. And we know a lot more about that. We know that at 6 months they are capable of pain. Now, that's a piece of legislation that has passed the House, but it hasn't passed the Senate, and the current president wouldn't sign it. We can make sure that we're not funding abortion, and we can defund Planned Parenthood. Everybody talks about defunding Planned Parenthood, and I'm glad they're talking about it now. But when I was working in Congress, actually was part of a team that did defund international Planned Parenthood. And everybody said we couldn't do it because Bill Clinton was president. And we were paying hundreds of millions of dollars a year in population assistance funds to organizations that mainly promoted and or performed abortions overseas. Technically, we didn't pay for the abortions. They paid for the abortions with some other money, but we gave them hundreds of millions of dollars. We enriched them and empowered them. And they were our representatives overseas when it came to population issues. Well, the second to last year of the Clinton administration, we, simply because our issue was the last one decided in one of those big bills that you had to read after it passed, we managed to get President Clinton to sign something that cut those agencies by about a third if they wouldn't forego abortion. And they didn't, and so they didn't get the money. The next year, the last year of the Clinton administration, we made a deal that President Clinton signed that said they wouldn't get any money until after the election. And of course, the election was won by George W. Bush, and therefore they didn't get any money that year, and they didn't get any money for 8 years. So it can be done. And part of the trick to winning these battles in Washington, not just to talking tough about them, to winning them, first of all, you should actually be polite to your adversary. You should try to understand their position. You should try to understand that no matter how horrible their position is from your point of view, they're human beings. And they've got feelings and they've got values. If you begin by calling them a communist, they're not going to really want to give you very much in the negotiations. But if you are respectful and polite, but you are also relentless, you say, look, this is a red line, and it really is a red line, and we can't cross it because we can compromise, but we cannot compromise away our principles. You'll win a lot more than if you do the opposite. And if you talk tough, and if you call people names, but you don't understand enough about the issues, they win the negotiation. Most of the candidates in this race agree with me on most of what I've just said, which means that the voters of the 3rd District have both a happy choice, because you've got 7 or 8 candidates who would be good conservative members of Congress, and an unhappy choice, because you have to choose among all those good people. There are 3 reasons that I'd like to suggest that you consider me. One of them is that I do have this track record. I'm not just talking about these issues. I've been working on them. I was Ronald Reagan's judicial selection specialist. We changed the face of the federal judiciary because we insisted that our candidates, our judicial candidates, not only be vetted for their qualifications, but also for their commitment to the Constitution. And by the way, the mainstream media were not too happy about that. They had just started to figure out that Ronald Reagan got to appoint judges, and they didn't like that he should appoint people who voted for him, even in the primary. But we did. We appointed a lot of really good judges. The face of the judiciary has been changed a couple of times since then, but we got a lot of credit and a lot of blame, and I have some scars to show for it. The last couple of years I was in the government, my job was to go around trying to convince countries to vote for us more often in the United Nations, including on issues like abortion and on traditional marriage. And we got more votes because we did that. I won some negotiations in the United Nations that we weren't supposed to win because you understand the issues, you are principled on the issues, you don't compromise, and you also try to understand your adversary. You try to understand their point of view, and you try to understand what you can get. We passed some things in the United Nations that people were surprised at, that reaffirmed the universal values that are also American values. The second reason is that there are lots of reasons to want to be in public office. You might want to be running for another office in a couple of years. You might want to burnish your resume. You might want to just have the sheer joy of being there in the center of power and influence. Well, you know, I've got a pretty good resume. I'm not running for anything else besides the House of Representatives, and I didn't take any particular joy in being in Washington all those years. I usually didn't like it. I did it because I thought it was important. And if I go to Washington, I'm going to be all about the issues. I'm going to go in every morning and I'm going to say, what can I do today to make there be a smaller government, to make there be a less expensive and a more responsive government? What can I do today to get an American foreign policy that's worthy of America? What can I do today to protect the right to life from our unborn children to our disabled and our elderly people? I promise you that's the only reason I want to go there, and that's what I'll be working on if I do go there. And the final reason is that, you know, everybody in this race has a great resume, actually. We've got people who've been in the military, we've got people who've been in law enforcement, we've got people who've run private businesses, and I applaud people who've done other public service. I applaud all of their service. But you have to look at whose resume, whose background, whose experience is actually going to prepare them to be the best congressman. And as I say, I don't only know how to talk about these issues, I know my way around Washington. I'm not afraid to say no, and I've learned how to win these battles, and that's what we need. So I thank you very much for your consideration, and I'm happy to take any questions that you want.
Once again, thank you for coming this evening. We appreciate your time sharing it with us. One of the biggest challenges that we have presently is the flooding in the 3rd Congressional District. What role do you think the federal government should play with reference to the recovery, funding of the recovery here in the 3rd Congressional District?
Well, it's too soon to know how much recovery is going to be needed, so it's hard to answer the question except in principle. I will tell you in principle, if I were creating a governmental system from the ground up, I probably wouldn't have the federal government in the business of local disaster relief. It's not one of the functions I think that the framers contemplated. It's generally when you turn things over to the federal government, you are turning them over to the branch of the level of government that knows the least about what's going on in the ground. I would have these be functions of local governments, of state governments, of other non-governmental institutions like churches and families as much as possible. Having said that, I'm also a small c conservative, and I understand that you can't just suddenly throw away a system that's developed over 200 years. And on a lot of issues, whether it's the social safety net or the Food and Drug Administration or this disaster relief. You know, Davy Crockett, I was talking to somebody about Davy Crockett here, who was a member of Congress when he was in his 20s before he went and died at the Alamo. Davy Crockett's maiden speech was about how voting against flood relief for some other part of the country. He said he felt for those people, he wanted to help them, but he just didn't think that his oath allowed him to vote to use federal taxpayer money. We've come a long way since then, and the federal government, I mean, we've come to depend on the federal government. And the federal government is probably, certainly when you get a big disaster like Katrina, they're essential to the solution. And so much as we should be looking in the long run to localize these solutions, we do need the federal government when we have a big disaster. There are, FEMA has people, sometimes they do it very badly, but they do have people who are experts on these things. And I do want to say that the person who did the best job so far in the flood was our local mayor, Joel Robideau, who 24 hours before the governor got around to declaring a disaster, I hate those robocalls. I may have to do some robocalls in this campaign, but I really don't like them. But I got the robocall, and it was from Joel Robideau, and instead of, inviting me to a town hall or something, he was telling me that I better stay inside. I better not be on the roads because the flooding was worse than I might have known that it was. And so I think our local government is doing a great job. I don't know yet whether I know the federal government's involved because when they've declared part of the state to be a disaster area already. It's too soon to tell whether the state and the federal government are doing a good job, but they're all going to have to play their roles.
Thank you. Obviously, you have a great deal of academic and work experience, and that's a tremendous asset. But why do you believe that this experience makes you uniquely qualified to be our next congressman?
Well, I've partly answered that in my presentation earlier. When I worked in Congress, of course, the first year I worked in Congress, I was 21 years old and I was working for Congressman Treen, and I didn't get to sit in any of the rooms when the decisions were made. But the last 8 years that I worked in Congress, I was working first for Congressman Chris Smith and then for Congressman Henry Hyde, two very strongly pro-life members of Congress. And so because of that and because of their position as chairman of a subcommittee and of the full committee, respectively, of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I was the lead negotiator for the pro-life side on all these international abortion, international population funding battles. And we won most of those battles, and we won them even when there was a Democratic president. So I've actually had experience. I'm so happy that mainstream conservative Republicans are now talking about defunding Planned Parenthood, and it's an important thing to do. But again, I don't know just how to talk about that issue. I've actually been in rooms where those issues were being decided, and you can talk to people who worked with me. I always got credit for getting a lot more in the bill than my cards entitled me to. And so I can't prove that to you, but it was my reputation. Later on, I was an ambassador. I got to represent the values and interests of the greatest nation in the world, first in a new little country that was just getting started and that actually wanted our help and that wanted our advice. They wanted to know how we did things because they thought they might want to do them the same way. It was a wonderful experience, but it also gave me experience in knowing what you can and cannot accomplish in negotiations. So unfortunately, whoever gets elected to Congress from this district is going to be one of 435. And it's going to be he because it's all men running. I was going to say he or she, but he will be a freshman congressman. So you really need to get somebody who's going to be able to hit the ground running. Again, I think others have had great experiences, but I think my experiences as learning how Washington works, especially when it works badly, and learning how to minimize the bad and maximize the good is going to be important. You know, I was in Washington all those years, but I honestly was never of it. And particularly on the pro-life side, I like to think I was literally on the side of the angels. But just being on the right side is not enough. And I think that if you look at the things I've done, I understand the issues, I understand the processes, and I think I'd be able to hit the ground running.
Thank you again. My last question is, what is your level of commitment in promoting and maintaining environmentally safe air and groundwater standards across the 3rd Congressional District? And do you believe that the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, should be given more jurisdiction and more money to increase regulations for safe water and air in our region?
Well, environmental protection, particularly when some kinds of environmental regulations do have an impact on economic activity and on people's economic lives, what you want is exactly what Goldilocks wanted. You do not want it to be too hot, you do not want it to be cold, you want it exactly right. So what do we want? Do we want no environmental regulation? Of course not. We want clean air, we want clean water, we're entitled to it. The air and the water belong to everybody. Somebody who pollutes the air in order to externalize the costs of his or her business is arguably stealing from people. So we need regulation to make sure that the air and the water are safe. Having said that, you can't just turn over billions of dollars and infinite authority to any federal agency and say, we trust you. It doesn't work that way. And I'm afraid we've done that sometimes with the EPA. And people tell me, for instance, I'm not an expert on this, I promise I'll become one, but people tell me that after the BP oil spill, we all knew that something went badly wrong there. And we all know that whatever our regulations and whatever our enforcement is, we want to make sure that no BP oil spill ever happens again. But people tell me that it was a little bit like the legislation we passed after September 11th, where every good idea and every bad idea that anybody had ever had on the subject all went into the bill and we passed it all. So people who are in the oil well business tell me that it's a whole lot harder to do an offshore oil well today than it was before, and not all in ways that are directly related to, that are really related to safety. And so we have to take a close look at those regulations. I'm not going to be an anti-environmentalist, but I am going to be pro-drilling, and I am going to be pro the survival and the prosperity of the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, let's talk that one.
I've asked all my questions, so it's up to anybody in the audience that would like to ask a question. If you could come forward, if that's possible.
Yeah.
Sir, you talked about
Maybe if you could.
the good people I'm John Rougeau, American Legion Post 69, about the good people in the State Department and the Justice Department.
Maybe you can back up and turn just a
Okay.
little bit so that the camera can.
Okay.
There you go.
If there's so many good people in there, why do we have the problems we have in there? And I can tell you one thing. We had that experience with one of our governors. He didn't clean out. You know, a governor, when he comes to town, they have 5,000 jobs they can appoint. Well, if you don't get rid of these 5 that were appointed by the other one, you're not going to get anything through the state, and that happened. Same thing with the president coming in. If you don't clean out the State Department and the Justice Department, because there are maybe some good people in there, but if they speak out, they get fired or they get checkmated and they can't do anything. There's got to be a clean house of both these departments, and the president has to take a more active role in it and stuff like getting rid of them, no matter what the press says and stuff like this. Also with the regulations and the different bureaucratic agencies we have, that has come about because the congressmen, the senators, just didn't want to do the job that they should have done. And they said, well, let's put this agency here, so let them take care of it and stuff like that. When that should be the congressmen and the senators concerned with their country, every aspect of that country. But they spend so little time in Washington. I know, I've worked there, stuff like this. And they spend so little time going when they call a house roll, stuff like this. There's nothing being done. It's bureaucrats that are doing everything. And they have no one to answer to. Because they're there for life. They appointed whatever leader got in and appointed them for their term or whatever. And I think that's what we need right here. We need to get rid of a lot of people that have been. And if you go back and you check right after World War II. Remember that Amnesia incident after World War II? Are you familiar with that? When the federal government actually went and hid files from the court and stuff like this, and several people went to jail because of that. Not because they were innocent, but because the files were hidden and stuff like this. Our actual government broke the law to protect themselves and send some other people to prison. That has gone on forever. There's a lot that needs to be done. That's all I got to say. I'm not satisfied with that. Some good people in there.
Ambassador Rees would ask that you give us your comments, please.
What was the question?
Yeah, exactly. What was the diatribe?
It was a 3-part question, I think. With respect to the people who are in the government and what can the president do to clean out? Well, of course, under the federal system, you've got the Federal Civil Service, and in the case of the State Department, the Foreign Service, and those people cannot be fired by the president without cause. I mean, you have to prove that they did something really awful. So those people are going to be there. Now, a very small percentage of the people in the federal government at the top levels are non-career people who, exactly for the reasons you suggest, the president has the right to appoint, each president does, and typically presidents don't keep the one from the president before, at least not if he or she was a president of another party. So those people will be replaced. But, you know, when I was in the State Department, one of the compliments that was paid to Secretary Powell and then to Secretary Rice was they listened to the building. And what they meant by that, they do what we want her to do. And you have to have people at the top levels, and I admired Secretary Powell and Secretary Rice, but I did think they listened to the building a little too much. You need to have people who don't mind being disliked by the people they work with if the reasons that they're being disliked are not good reasons. If what they're doing is implementing policies that the president wants them to implement, even though those are not the policies that the career people in the agency want them to implement. And that's hard. It takes strength of character, it takes belief, you kind of have to be a true believer. So if I were the president, God forbid, and I were picking those 5,000 or 10,000 or 15,000 people that you can have as your policy people in the agencies, I'd be picking true believers. As far as other scandals in the federal government, they happen. I mean, one of the problems is that God didn't create any perfect people. We have to deal with original sin, and therefore we can have people who are basically good but still corruptible. And there's a lot in Washington that will gnaw away at whatever in you is corruptible, which is one of the reasons we should
because they're not subject to the same punishment and laws that we're subject to. They're above the law. Magna Carta they don't know about, you know.
Well, we need to fix that to the extent that there are different. I even say, you know, you go to the airport and you're waiting in that TSA line, and suddenly somebody breezes by you, and it's an airline crew member. Now, I like airline crew members. I think they're good people. But I think that a good system is one that would apply to everybody, where the employees and the customers have to both obey the same rules, and then they'd be a lot more careful about the rules that they imposed on the customers. And the same thing goes for government. If you can't live by a rule yourself, then you shouldn't be imposing it on the ordinary citizens.
I can tell you're not a Democrat, are you?
Well, I'm not, but I like to think I'd believe that if I were a Democrat.
Another question for you.
Republican or Democrat?
I'm a Republican.
Some of my friends are coming around to agree with me that there is a stealth movement afoot to strip away the sovereignty of the United States and merge us with other countries under a one world government, probably the United Nations. Do you agree? And if so, what can you share with us what you observed?
Well, there have been people quite openly for, since the 1940s, since the United Nations was founded. There was an organization called the World Federalist Society. And I think actually Alan Cranston, who became a senator from California, had been the head of the World Federalists. So there have been people all along who thought that that would be a good thing. That song that, I don't know why they have to sing that song at birthday parties and stuff. Out of all the Beatles songs, I was a big Beatles fan, but imagine there's no countries, imagine no religion, and so forth. I always wanted to write a counter song about imagine no communists, imagine no atheists, but that I guess wouldn't have been as big of a hit. So there have always been those people who somehow thought that it would be better if we didn't have individual governments, we just had the world government. But look at what's happening with Europe. I mean, I have to admit that whatever the economic implications, I would have voted for Brexit if I were in England. And I would have been one of those people in France and in Ireland and in Sweden who every time they put a more powerful European Union to a referendum in an individual country, it either almost lost or it did lose. So I think that bigger governments at higher levels, we've shown that it's not the best way to increase human freedom or human prosperity. We need to go the opposite way. We need to empower, the primary government you deal with should be your local government. And the federal government should be a referee most of the time. That's not the system we have, but I certainly would not endorse. I don't think there's any immediate danger of it, but if there is, believe me, I'll be on your side about world government.
Ed, come on up, please.
I got a couple of 3 questions here. One, you said you must respect your opponent, treat them respectfully when you're dealing in Congress or wherever in a political situation. Well, with that in mind, I want to ask your opinion of Mr. Trump, his methodologies. Do you think he is presidential? And I'll let you go ahead and answer.
Well, Donald Trump was not my first, second, or third choice for the Republican nomination. I don't like his style. Somebody was telling me yesterday, look, he's from New York. What do you want? That's just how they talk there. But and it's true. I wouldn't vote for Charles Schumer either. But now we do have what's largely a two-party system. I think that I'm going to have to choose between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And on some issues, I don't trust Donald Trump. He hasn't been pro-life for very long. The conservative positions that he's taking, the promises on the judiciary, I don't know how to assess the chances that he'll keep those promises. But I do trust Hillary Clinton. And I trust her to do exactly the wrong thing on every issue. And it isn't like her character is anything to write home about either. Now here I'm violating my rule about being nice to my adversary. I'm sure she's got a lot of good qualities. And actually, when I met her once back in the 90s, she was far more charming than she is now on the campaign trail. But But I will have to vote between imperfect choices. And I will take the imperfect choice who I disagree with less on the issues. And I think if there's a candidate who there's a chance is going to do the right thing on the right to life, on the economy, on national defense, I'll have to vote for that person with all his flaws over somebody who I'm pretty sure is going to do the wrong thing on just about every issue.
You're running for the House of Representatives, and I'm sure you've been to Washington a lot of times, and you've been down K Street, you know where all the lobbyists are and all of that. I just want to me, this is my opinion, I'm not sure my vote counts anymore. Because the large corporations and the really rich can pay off the lobbyists easily. They go through the back door of Congress, walk right on in, and get exactly what they want. How are you going to handle that?
Well, I'll tell you how I handled it when I was a staff member. Because actually, the lobbyists don't only try to influence members of Congress, they probably spend more of their time trying to influence their staffs. We had some hearings when I was working on the Foreign Affairs Committee on really evil governments, like in Burma and in Sudan, where they had slavery. And then I would get calls after the hearings, or sometimes before, from lobbying firms in Washington. And these were all people who'd worked for another Republican congressman that I knew, and maybe sometimes I even knew the lobbyist. And they'd say, let me take you to lunch. I really want to talk to you. I think you misunderstand the situation in Sudan or in Burma. And I would say the same thing to all of them. I'd say, look, nothing against you, but I'm not going to let you treat me to lunch. I will, however, meet with your client at their embassy, and I will tell them what they have to do to get Congress off their backs. And what they have to do to get Congress off their backs is to stop having slavery, is to stop using rape as an instrument of conflict or as an instrument of oppression of your own people. There's a list that I have, and I want to be able to give them the list not through you, but directly myself. So if you want to set up a meeting with your client, I'm glad to meet with the client, but it won't be a love fest. But what I won't do is have them think that the way to get Congress off their backs is to hire you instead of to change your behavior. Now, you know, sometimes lobbyists are representing viewpoints I agree with. And I'm not going to not do something just because a lobbyist advocates it. And I don't want to tell you I'll never meet with a lobbyist, but I'm pretty sure that I've never done anything just because a lobbyist wanted me to, and I won't change that if I'm elected.
Okay, time to get to the money.
I thought you just did.
Taxes. We know that the IRS tax code covers thousands of pages, and it's very complicated and very overwritten, in my opinion. What's the chance of us getting a simplified tax form, actually getting the IRS tax rewritten, or maybe even going to a flat tax or a postcard tax that has been proposed in the past? And what's your opinion on that, and what would you do in that way?
Well, it puts me in mind of during the Jimmy Carter administration, where he talked about tax reform, and people were sending out, in those days we didn't have the internet, but it was being faxed everywhere. And it really looked like a Form 1040. It said, new simplified Form 1040 under President Carter. And there were only two questions. And question one, how much money did you make last year? And it had a little box for that. And question two, send it in. So the devil is all in the details. Everybody's for tax reform. For me, as I said earlier, the key is that it be revenue neutral or even lower the percentage of the taxpayers' money that the government at all levels is collecting. And I'll be for any tax reform that does that. And I agree it should be simplified. We do have all these loopholes, which are often there because of lobbyists, not so much because of abstract principles. And we need to get rid of those. But we need to get rid of those as part of a system that also lowers the rates. I wouldn't be, a flat tax is appealing to me. but it's not the only way to fix the problem. I mean, there are some deductions that we'd want to keep just because people have relied on them, and the mortgage interest deduction is the obvious one. Charitable deductions are probably a good thing if we want charitable institutions to be robust. But that doesn't mean that you should be able to deduct the appreciated value of something you didn't pay anything for. There are a lot of scandals in that direction too. So I'd be willing to take a real hard look at the tax code and to simplify it a lot, but let's just make sure that when we're simplifying it, we're not making the government bigger and more powerful. We're giving people more control of their lives.
I could keep you here all night. One of the fallacies I guess we hear is that when you become a congressman and go to Washington, one of the first classes they hold is excuse making and justification. We really don't know who in the heck to believe about anything. No matter what the subject is, half of them is for it and half of them are against it. Is there any truth to the fact that across the street from the Capitol, that there is one section of the building located for the Republicans and another for the Democrats, where you are obligated to spend about 4 hours a day making phone calls, begging for money for your campaign? I've seen that on 3 different TV networks, and it's repulsive to me. Another question, who in God's name, I think I know the answer, but I want to get your opinion, made it possible for men to go into female restrooms and shower rooms and so forth? That ain't going to go in Lafayette, I do not believe. I don't care what the government says. I mean, there's certain things, I'm 83 years of age, there's some things I don't give a darn. I ain't going to do it, period. Thank you.
Well, on the first question, yes, except for the word obligated. There is the Republican Congressional Committee has an office, and I guess the Democratic one does too, and they do have little rooms because you're not allowed to solicit funds from your office in the Capitol. So there's a place 2 blocks away where congressmen go. I don't know. I suspect there are probably some who spend 4 hours a day there. The ones I knew didn't. They would go there when they had to make a fundraising call, but that wasn't 4 hours a day every day of the week. I think that in this campaign, I mean, there's somebody in this room who told me that I'm not going to be an effective candidate, I'm not going to win unless I spend 6 to 8 hours on the phone every day trying to raise money. Now, there may be some days in the next month or 2 where I do spend 6 or 8 hours a day, but so far, every single day, there have been things that seemed more important in the way of writing position papers and the things that we think of when you think about running for office, coming to events like this. And so while I really do want to raise enough money to win, and that's more money than I've raised so far, we've got several candidates who've raised a lot more than I have. And people tell me if I can't catch up with them, I'm going to lose. I hope I do catch up with them, and I hope if I don't catch up with them, I still win. But I think it certainly, if you're running for election or re-election, it's easier if you've got $1 million in the bank. And so there are probably people who think, if I spend 4 hours on the phone every day raising all that money, then I don't have to do anything else. It doesn't matter how I vote. It doesn't matter whether I understand the issues. I'll still get reelected because I'll have great television. It doesn't always work. Sometimes the guy with the $1 million and the great television loses. So we do have a democratic system, even though it's a profoundly imperfect one. The second issue I'm totally with you on, this idea that if you identify as a woman, then you're a woman. I mean, look, I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feelings. There was an actress, Barbara Hershey was her name. She was quite popular. She was in some movies when I was young. She's probably about my age. And she was in a movie where they had a seagull, and that they had to do multiple takes with this seagull, and the seagull died. And so she changed her name. She was taking a lot of drugs at the time. She changed her name to Barbara Seagull, S-E-A-G-U-L-L, and she appeared in several movies as Barbara Seagull. Didn't help her career, but I remember there was an article about it, and they quoted some movie producer as saying, "Hey, look, the kid's big box office. She wants to be a seagull, she's a seagull." Look, if somebody wants to decide that he's a woman and get all his friends to call him a woman and go to work and dress like a woman, I'm not going to spend any energy trying to convince that person that he's wrong. But the idea that the rest of us are obliged, either the rest of us when it means small governments, when it means merchants, because that's usually what we're talking about with restrooms, or whether it means private citizens, are somehow obliged to validate that self-identification is a very different question. And there's a balance between equality and freedom. And in this country, much more than in some of the social democracies in Europe, we've tended to err on the side of freedom, not on the side of equality. And you cannot enforce equality, especially among things that to the naked eye don't actually look equal, without infringing on people's freedom. And this is a related question to if I'm a baker and somebody comes in and they want me to bake a cake that celebrates a marriage that I don't really think is a marriage, can I be sued, and can the people win, and can I be put out of business because I won't bake that cake? And it turns out, so far in a couple of jurisdictions, the answer is yes. That, it seems to me, is a profound distortion of the idea of freedom. I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feelings. I've got friends who, I don't know if I have any friends who think they're a gender other than the one they were born with, but I certainly have friends who are attracted to genders other than the one I think they should be attracted to. And I'm not trying to hurt their feelings. They're good people. But I don't think that the rest of us have to reshape society just to make other people feel better.
Do we have any other questions? If not, Ambassador, do you have?
One more question, sir.
You have to come up here. You have to come up here. Come all the way up.
Isn't our country, our laws
Now we
founded
need,
on?
let's come on up here. And I ask you to ask a question. Not
Isn't it
comment,
true
just a
our
question.
laws are founded, the English common law, or any laws in history are founded on common sense? What is common sense as the basic principle of making our laws and rules and stuff like this? To do what we're doing today with the Supreme Court, it's taking common sense and putting it at the very end, at the bottom of the stack, and completely ignoring it. If I want to be a girl and I want to dress and go to work and stuff like this and consider myself a girl and stuff like this, it's not common sense to allow a person to do this or to go in places that women congregate in as opposed to where men congregate in. Where is common sense? You know, I mean.
Well, I wish our law were based on common sense, but the English common law was based as much on the competing interests of kings and nobles as it was on common sense. Fortunately, of course, in Louisiana we have the civil law and not the common law mostly. And that was an effort to base laws on common sense, and sometimes they got it right. But as far as the Constitution is concerned, I'm reminded of an incident where Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes was sitting on the steps of the Supreme Court, which in those days were closer to the street than they are now, and somebody went by and said, "Do justice, sir," and he was paying him a compliment. And Holmes chased him down the street and said, wagged his finger in his face and said, "It's not my job to do justice. My job is to play the game according to the rules." Now, I didn't always agree with Oliver Wendell Holmes, but I wish that the court agreed with him on that. I think that they are too much trying to impose their own view of common sense, which they only get by only talking to people who agree with them, and not enough trying to follow the rules. I mean, the court's power, the court's authority comes from the Constitution. And that means the Constitution is a real thing. It's not something they have the right to keep reinventing every year. What they've done is they've divorced the content of their opinions from the justification for their opinions. And ultimately, when you do that, there's going to be trouble. And we're already having trouble. So I wish, much as I am an admirer of common sense, the problem is that not everybody agrees with me about what common sense is, and that's a problem that we haven't been able to solve yet. So I'd rather the Supreme Court paid careful attention to what the rules really say and try to apply those rules, and then leaves the rest to the legislature instead of what they're doing. Thank you.
If we have no other questions, you have a few minutes to sum up your positions.
Well, I think you've all heard quite enough of my positions. I just want to thank you all for being here. Thank you for considering my candidacy. Again, I think we've got some great candidates, and somebody who's my friend who supports one of the other candidates is going to still be my friend. But I would. I'd be greatly honored and greatly enthusiastic about the prospect of going to Washington just one last time and working on these issues and working on trying to put our government more in line with American values and with Acadiana values. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming this evening. Our next meeting is going to be 2 weeks after Labor Day. That's September 19th. And Superintendent Aguilar will be here to answer educational issues. Thank you all very much for coming this evening. And special thanks to our speaker.